There was a man once not born strong, but forged strong. His name was not important. What mattered was the fire inside him, and how he faced the storm of his own mind. Each dawn, he bowed before the rising sun, blade resting across his knees, heart still as the mountain. He followed no crowd, feared no silence. For in that silence, he met himself. They said Musashi trained alone for years, fighting not men, but weakness. He believed that strength was not in muscle or sword, but in spirit. The real battle was unseen between the man you are and the man you refuse to become. This is the way of inner strength, 30 days of walking the invisible path, a journey where you will face your fear, crush your ego, and rise with presence so unshakable that even chaos bows before it. You will learn that the warrior's greatest weapon is not his blade, but his discipline. And in that discipline lies the soul of mastery. The path began on a morning soaked in mist. The young warrior walked for miles until the trail ended before an old wooden gate where the characters Musin no Dao, the way of no mind, were carved deep into weathered wood. Beyond it lay silence. No sound of steel, no echo of shouting men, only the steady hum of the wind through bamboo. Inside, he found a single figure sweeping the floor. The old master's hands were calloused, his robe plain, his posture unshakable. The warrior bowed deeply, expecting a greeting, perhaps a test. None came. The master only gestured to the broom, then to the floor. For days, he swept, morning until dusk, under cold rain and burning sun. He waited for lessons in combat forms, strikes, the secret techniques whispered of in stories. None came. Only dust, silence, and repetition. At first, resentment grew. Why waste time like this, he thought. His pride whispered that this was beneath him. But every time frustration rose, the master's calm eyes met his. No anger, no explanation, only stillness. Science calls this process neural rewiring repetition, reshaping the mind, building patience like a muscle. But the ancients understood it long before modern psychology. Through mundane discipline, they trained presence. By the seventh day, something subtle changed. The broom no longer felt like punishment. Each sweep was a breath. Each sound of straw against the floor became rhythm. For the first time, his thoughts slowed. He began to notice the tiny things, the dust dancing in sunlight, the quiet thud of his own heartbeat, the warmth of air on his palms. When he finally looked up, the master was gone. Only the echo of his broom remained. In that emptiness, the student felt something stir, not understanding, but awareness. The dojo was no longer just wood and walls, it was reflection, and his mind, for the first time, was beginning to clear. The following morning, the warrior awoke before dawn. The air was cool and heavy with dew. When he slid open the paper doors, the horizon was a slow-breathing ember, soft orange fading into gray. The broom stood where he had left it, but now it no longer mocked him. It waited. He picked it up without being told. And as he swept, he understood the broom was not for the floor, it was for his mind. Each motion cleared another layer of noise, another fragment of ego. The master appeared quietly behind him. "Do you hear it?" he asked. The young man paused. "Hear what, master?" "The silence," the old man said. "It speaks, but only to those who listen." In the days that followed, the student learned to listen, not with ears, but with awareness. The groan of the wood, the sigh of the wind, the pulse in his wrist all merged into one soundless truth. The present moment was alive. He began to notice how the mind wandered like dust, stirred by every gust of thought, and how returning to the act, sweeping, breathing, being anchored it again. Neuroscience calls this attentional anchoring. The ancients called it zanshin, the state of remaining mind, awareness after action. As weeks passed, the warrior's movements grew smoother. His breath steadied. He found himself moving without thought, the broom gliding as naturally as wind through leaves. What was once discipline had become meditation in motion. One evening, as twilight melted into the tatami floor, the master placed a small bowl of water before him. "Look," he said. "What do you see?" "My reflection," the student replied. The master nodded. "And if the water were dirty, I would see nothing." "Then understand this. the master said softly. "The dojo, the broom, the silence, they are your water. Keep them clean. Only then can you see who you truly are." The student bowed, understanding that the true battle had already begun, not with sword, but with self. That night he wrote a single line on the wall. "Only when the floor of the mind is swept can one stand firm upon it." As the candlelight flickered, he realized this was not the end of his training, but the beginning of awareness. The empty dojo had taught him the first law of mastery. Before learning to strike, one must learn to see. And to see clearly, he would soon need to face what hides in the dark fear itself. The forest began where the village ended, a place locals avoided after sunset. The trees stood tall and ancient, their twisted roots like veins gripping the earth. When the master ordered him to meditate there alone until dawn, the warrior thought it was a test of endurance. He was wrong. It was a confrontation with himself. As twilight bled away, the forest turned to shadow. The air thickened, heavy with unseen motion. Every creak, every whisper of leaves felt alive. Fear slithered through him, slow, cold, intimate. He sat beneath an old cedar, spine straight, hands resting upon his knees. The ground was damp, breathing the scent of earth and decay. He closed his eyes as he had been taught, but the silence here was not peaceful. It was predatory. At first came the sounds, snapping twigs, soft footsteps, imagined or real. Then came the thoughts. What if something watches me? What if I fail? What if I am not ready? The forest became a mirror, reflecting every shadow he had buried. The master had once said, "Fear is not your enemy, it is your untrained awareness." He remembered that now, but it did little to calm him. His pulse hammered, his throat tightened. He wanted to flee, but something deeper whispered, "Stay." Modern science would call this exposure response prevention, sitting through fear until the body learns it will not die from it. The ancients had no such term. They simply called it courage. The hours stretched like years. His legs trembled, his mind screamed. Yet still he sat. Each time fear surged, he returned to breath, steady, slow, deliberate. In the rhythm of his breathing, he began to feel the forest differently. The branches swaying, the insects moving, none were against him. They simply were. Nature was not cruel. It was indifferent, the same indifference that builds storms and births flowers. He realized then, fear is not an external enemy. It is the friction between reality and our resistance to it. When we stop resisting, fear dissolves into observation. A wind rose from the east, cool and sharp. It brushed his face like a hand. He opened his eyes and saw the forest not as darkness, but as movement, a living pulse, vast and neutral. Somewhere, deep within, the trembling eased. The storm was still there, but it no longer commanded him. He was no longer the hunted. He was the observer. As dawn's first light touched the treetops, the master's voice appeared from behind him. "You stayed." The warrior nodded, too tired to speak. "What did you find in the dark?" he answered quietly. "Myself." The master smiled. "Then you have learned the first truth of fear. It never leaves, but it loses its teeth." The student bowed, humbled. His body was cold, but his spirit alive. When they returned to the dojo, dawn had already risen. The master walked ahead in silence, his sandals brushing against gravel. The young warrior followed, every step heavier but strangely lighter within. Fear had not vanished. It had transformed, no longer a shadow chasing him, but a companion walking beside him. Inside, the master poured tea. Steam coiled into the air, carrying the scent of earth and warmth. "You faced the forest," he said quietly. "But the forest was never the trial." The student frowned. "Then what was, master?" "The noise within you," the master said, handing him the cup. "Fear feeds on imagination. It grows fat on stories you tell yourself. When you sit long enough in silence, the story runs out of words." The student drank in silence. The tea was bitter, grounding. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. The master continued, "Every man must walk through his forest. Some run and never return. Some fight and lose to their own shadows. Few sit long enough to see that nothing was ever chasing them." That evening, as sunlight turned the paper walls amber, the student reflected. He realized how his mind had shaped every monster he had feared: the failure, the rejection, the judgment. All of them lived not outside, but inside. Science calls this amygdala reconditioning, retraining the brain to separate signal from illusion, but the ancients expressed it more poetically. When the water stills, the moon is clear. He began to see fear as a teacher, not an obstacle. Each tremor, each pulse of dread was a call to awareness. The body's way of saying, "Wake up, be here." Fear, in truth, was presence in disguise. That night, he knelt before the altar at the center of the dojo. A single candle burned. Its flame bent slightly to the wind, yet never went out. The student watched the flicker, understanding for the first time that courage was not the absence of that trembling, it was holding steady despite it. He wrote again upon the wall, "Fear teaches what safety hides." The master read it the next morning and nodded. "Then your next lesson begins," he said. "You have faced fear. Now, face the self that feeds it, the ego." The warrior looked up. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, another storm was beginning. And so, from fear's shadow, he would enter the realm of pride, where the greatest battles are fought without witnesses. Spring came softly to the valley. Cherry blossoms drifted across the dojo courtyard like silent snow, each petal a whisper of impermanence. The young warrior had grown stronger, his movements sharper. His mornings began with meditation, his days with training, his nights with stillness. Yet beneath this calm rhythm, a seed had begun to grow, subtle, poisonous, invisible: pride. It began with admiration from the villagers who watched him practice. His strikes were clean, his posture steady. "He is becoming a master," they said. And in those words, the young man found comfort. He began to move, not for the path, but for the praise. One afternoon, a traveler arrived, a swordsman in tattered armor, carrying a blade dull from use. His eyes were calm, his stance unguarded. The young warrior, curious and eager to prove his worth, approached him. "Spar with me," he said. The master, sweeping in the distance, looked up but said nothing. The traveler bowed, and the duel began. The young warrior struck first, fast, precise, powerful. But the older man's blade moved like water, deflecting, redirecting, never clashing. Within moments, the student's breath grew ragged, his movements sloppy. Then, with a simple motion, the traveler disarmed him. His sword clattered to the ground. Humiliation burned hotter than the sun overhead. He fell to his knees, fists clenched. The traveler bowed once more and walked away without a word. The student could not meet his master's eyes. When he finally did, the old man said only, "You fought yourself again." That night, shame crawled through him like fire. He replayed every moment of the duel, each failed strike, each desperate movement. But deeper than the defeat was a darker truth. He had not fought to learn. He had fought to be seen. The master found him outside, sitting before the small pond near the dojo. "What did you lose today?" he asked. "My honor," the student said. The master shook his head. "You lost your illusion." The words stung. Yet, in them, he felt something break the fragile shell that pride had built. The old man continued, "The ego is a weight we polish, mistaking its shine for strength, but it only slows the spirit. Let it go." The warrior looked into the pond. The water shimmered with his reflection, calm, yet distorted by ripples. He reached out, and the image scattered. He realized then what the master meant. To see clearly, he had to stop staring at himself. That night, he sat in the dojo long after the candles had burned low. The scent of wax and old wood filled the air. The silence was heavy, not empty, but full of recognition. In psychology, this is called ego death, the collapse of the false self that stands between awareness and truth. To the ancients, it was known simply as mushin, the state of no mind, where one acts without self-consciousness or attachment. But the young warrior was not there yet. The path to no mind begins in the ruins of self-importance, and he was still learning to let those ruins fall. The next morning, the master told him, "Return to the traveler, bow to him." "Why?" the student asked. "To thank him for showing you where you still cling." The young man hesitated, pride still coiled around his chest. But he went. And in that bow, humble, sincere, something loosened inside him. For the first time, he felt light. When the warrior returned to the dojo, the morning light spilled across the floor in golden silence. The master was kneeling by the altar, burning incense. Without a word, the student bowed deeply and remained there, his forehead touching the wooden floor, his breath steady. The weight that once filled his chest was gone. It had not vanished through victory, but through surrender. The master spoke softly, as if to the wind. When the ego breaks, it sounds like loss. But in truth, it is the sound of space being made. The student sat beside him. "How do I live without it?" he asked. "You don't destroy ego," said the master. "You learn to see through it. Like mist, it looks solid, but disappears when you walk closer." He paused, watching the thin trail of smoke curl upward. "Most men fight to be seen. Few fight to see clearly. Which one will you be?" The student lowered his head. "I want to see." The old man nodded. "Then walk the path of humility. Let action speak what words cannot. Serve without witness. Move without seeking praise. When you can do this, the blade within will sharpen itself." Days turned into weeks. The warrior trained in silence, no longer chasing the applause of others. He repaired the roof when it leaked. He carried water from the river before dawn. He sharpened the tools, swept the floors, not as punishment, but as practice. The villagers stopped visiting, their curiosity fading. And strangely, that emptiness brought peace. Without their gaze, his movements became honest again. Every strike, every step, felt lighter, as if gravity itself had lessened its pull. In that solitude, he began to see how pride had distorted everything. It had made even good acts hollow, feeding off validation instead of virtue. The master's teachings deepened. When you act from ego, even victory chains you. When you act from awareness, even defeat frees you. One night, the master handed him a dull, rusted blade. "Polish this," he said, "every day, until it reflects your face." The task took weeks. The blade was stubborn, its surface scarred, clouded. Each night, he sanded, wiped, breathed, repeated. Slowly, the metal began to shine. When at last it mirrored his face, he realized the weapon's reflection was not his, it was his discipline. The master examined it and smiled faintly. "Do you see now? The sword did not change. You did. The rust was never the blade's fault." The lesson struck deep. The ego is like rust, invisible at first, yet deadly if ignored. It eats from within until even the sharpest edge dulls. Psychologists today speak of the default mode network, the brain's self-referential chatter, the constant I, me, mine. Musashi had spoken of the same centuries ago. Fixation on self is the source of all weakness. When the warrior finally set the polished sword down, the master extinguished the candle and whispered, "Now, you are ready for discipline. True discipline. The kind that does not bend for comfort." The student bowed, understanding that ego was not something to kill, but something to outgrow. That night he wrote upon the dojo wall, "The moment I stopped proving myself, I began improving myself." And when dawn broke the next morning, he stood outside as snow began to fall, cold, pure, cleansing. In the white silence of winter, discipline would become his fire. Winter came like a silent teacher, cruel, precise, unyielding. The mountains were buried under white, and the dojo's walls groaned against the wind. The young warrior rose before dawn each morning, breath clouding in the frozen air. His hands burned from the cold as he carried water from the stream, yet he never complained. The master had told him, "The body breaks first, the mind second, the spirit last. Train until only the spirit remains." Each day followed the same rhythm: rise before the sun, meditate in the snow, practice strikes until his arms trembled, then return to silence. To any outsider, it might have looked like suffering, but to him it was devotion, a daily ritual of becoming. At first, he sought strength through effort, but discipline soon revealed itself as something deeper, a dialogue between resistance and surrender. Some mornings, his legs refused to move, his breath came ragged, and his thoughts screamed for rest. Yet he learned to act anyway, not out of willpower, but out of reverence. The master once said, "Discipline is not punishment, it is worship of the path." Now he understood. The repetition, the same movements, same rituals were not cages, they were keys. Each repetition stripped away hesitation, sharpening his mind like a blade ground against stone. Modern psychology calls this habitual mastery, the brain reconfiguring itself through pattern and perseverance. Every repetition was rewiring him, turning choice into instinct, effort into essence. He trained with stones tied to his wrists, balancing in the snow for hours. His breath became rhythm, his body an instrument of presence. He no longer counted time in hours, but in awareness. When pain came, he did not resist it. He breathed through it, letting it dissolve into energy. One morning, the master approached as the student knelt beneath the falling snow, motionless for hours. "Why do you not move?" he asked. The student whispered, "Because movement would serve comfort, not purpose." The master smiled slightly. "Then you are learning the discipline that cannot be taught." That night, they sat by the dim fire, the only warmth in the dojo. Sparks rose and vanished into darkness. The master said, "Pain is not your enemy. It is the sculptor of character. Endure it, but do not worship it. Use it to carve clarity." The student nodded, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. His muscles ached, his joints screamed, but somewhere beneath the suffering, he felt a strange peace, as if his spirit had expanded to hold the pain rather than break beneath it. He began to see how comfort had once dulled his senses, made him forget his own strength. Now, each trial sharpened him, like the winter wind carving the edge of stone. And one evening, when he practiced alone in the courtyard, his blade slicing through snowflakes, he realized something profound. Discipline was not about control. It was about harmony, the body obeying the mind obeying truth. The master watched from the doorway, his face lit by torchlight. "The fire in you," he said quietly, "is no longer wild. It is steady." The student bowed, his breath merging with the cold air. The fire was not to burn others, it was to illuminate himself. The deeper the winter grew, the quieter the warrior became. Each day felt longer, but each movement grew more precise, not born from energy, but from essence. He no longer sought comfort, nor even progress. His practice became a vow, a silent covenant, between himself and the unseen path. The dojo roof leaked, where snow had melted into slow droplets. The young man repaired it by moonlight. His hands were numb, his breath shallow. Yet in every motion, he found grace. Even suffering now carried rhythm. Pain had become a teacher, not a punishment. The master spoke less these days, for words were no longer needed. Instead, he watched the way the student rose before the first bird's cry, how he bowed before eating, how even in exhaustion he moved with reverence. It was not obedience the master wanted to see, it was ownership. One night, after a long day's training, the student's body finally gave way. He collapsed in the courtyard, his sword slipping from his hand. The snow beneath him was red with the skin torn from his palms. He tried to rise, but his muscles refused. He stayed there, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the stars above. The master's voice came from the darkness. "Why continue when the body fails?" The student whispered. "Because if I stop now, I will never meet who I am on the other side of this pain." A faint smile crossed the old man's face. "Then endure. The pain will not destroy you. It will reveal you." That night, the student dreamt of fire. Not flames of destruction, but of purification, burning away hesitation, leaving only focus. When he awoke, the dawn was breaking, soft and golden. His body ached, but the ache no longer mattered. It was proof that he had entered a new threshold, one where pain and peace coexist. Psychologists today might describe this as flow state, where self vanishes and awareness merges with action. But to the ancients, it was Shugyo ascetic training that burns away the excess until only essence remains. Weeks passed. The snow began to thaw, revealing earth beneath. The student's body was lean, his eyes calm. One morning, the master led him to the river that cut through the mountain. The water was half frozen, but clear as glass. "Wash your hands," the master said. The warrior obeyed, wincing as the cold bit into his skin. "Why, master?" "To remember that life is not meant to be easy," the old man replied. "Ease dulls the spirit. Hardship refines it." The young man looked into the river and saw his reflection ripple with the current. For the first time, he did not see the eager student or the proud fighter. He saw a man being shaped by patience, forged by repetition, tempered by silence. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountain peaks, the master handed him a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges and smelling faintly of smoke. The student opened it carefully. Inside, written in bold, simple strokes, were 3 words: "The power of endurance." The master's voice was low, steady, almost tender. "This," he said, "is your fire. Not the fire that rages and devours, but the fire that survives, not born from anger or desire, but from patience. The quiet strength that burns without needing to be seen." The student looked at the words again, feeling them settle in his chest like embers refusing to die. For the first time, he understood. True fire is not loud. It is steady, invisible, and eternal. He carved one last line on the wall before leaving to meditate. The fire that burns within is not meant to consume, but to purify. Outside, the first shoots of spring were breaking through the snow, fragile yet unyielding. The warrior smiled, feeling the echo of that same strength within. And when spring returned, so did the sword. But this time, the blade would no longer test his strength, it would reveal his silence. Spring returned like a whisper. The snow melted into streams that carried the memory of winter away, and the air filled with the scent of pine and renewal. The dojo, once cold and dim, now glowed in soft morning light. The young warrior rose each day as he always had, bowing before the altar, sweeping the floors, training in silence. But something within him had shifted. His strength was no longer something he carried. It was something he had become. That morning, the master waited in the courtyard. In his hands rested a wooden sword, simple, unadorned, its surface polished by years of touch. He extended it toward the student. "It is time," he said. "You have learned stillness. Now, let stillness move." The student bowed deeply, accepting the weapon as if it were alive. The wood felt warm in his hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind passed gently through the trees, scattering petals across the stone floor. They took their stances. The air thickened, not with tension, but with presence. The master moved first, slow, deliberate, precise. The student responded, his blade rising and falling in rhythm, not as attack, but as conversation. Their movements were measured, almost graceful. Each strike was an answer to silence, each block a breath within stillness. There was no aggression, no noise, only awareness flowing between them. The clash of wood was not a battle, but a meeting, 2 streams merging into one current. The student began to sense something deeper, the space between strikes, the pauses where action dissolved into awareness. That invisible interval was where mastery lived, not in the motion, but in the restraint. The master's eyes were calm. "When you strike," he said softly, "strike with no thought of striking. When you defend, defend without fear of losing. The blade follows the mind follows presence, and presence follows nothing." The student moved again, his form instinctive, his breathing aligned with the rhythm of the world. Each motion was complete, yet effortless, like a leaf falling without resistance. The fight quickened. Their steps circled, blades whispering through air, wood meeting wood in the cadence of thunder and silence. But within the chaos, the student felt peace, a profound detachment, as if he were both the storm and the still eye at its center. Psychologists might call this the integration phase, when skill transcends conscious thought and becomes embodied wisdom. But the ancients described it simply: when the sword is forgotten, the warrior becomes the blade. At last, the master halted. The wooden swords froze mid-air, 1 inch apart. The silence was so deep, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Then, the master stepped back, lowering his weapon. "You no longer need my instruction," he said quietly. "The blade has accepted you." The student bowed, his chest rising with gratitude rather than pride. He finally understood that mastery was not a mountain to climb, but a circle to walk, a return to simplicity. That evening, He practiced alone under the fading sun. The world around him pulsed with life, the hum of insects, the whisper of wind, the distant song of water. His strikes flowed with the rhythm of nature itself. For the first time, there was no separation between the blade, the man, and the moment. He wrote upon the dojo wall before resting. When I became silent, the blade began to speak. The moon rose high above the valley, casting pale light through the paper doors. In that quiet glow, the student felt no victory, no triumph, only peace. The kind that cannot be earned, only revealed. Dawn broke over the mountains like a slow breath. The student stepped into the courtyard, wooden sword in hand, and bowed toward the east. There was no ceremony, no command from his master, only instinct, guiding him into motion. The air was cool, touched with the scent of rain. Each exhale left a cloud that drifted and disappeared, as fleeting as thought. He began to move not with the aggression of a fighter, but with the grace of one who listens. His blade cut through the air with quiet precision, tracing invisible arcs of discipline and memory. Each movement dissolved the boundary between effort and ease, between doing and being. The master watched from a distance, his hands folded behind his back. What he saw was not a student performing drills, but a man who had become rhythm itself. There was no strain in his movements, no hesitation, no trace of the boy who once sought strength to prove himself. When the body obeys, the master said softly, discipline begins. When the mind obeys, mastery begins. But when neither obeys, when both dissolve into motion, freedom begins. The student could feel this truth now. He no longer thought of his breath or stance. The body moved as the mind willed, and the mind moved as the world willed. He was not in control, he was in harmony. A storm gathered over the distant ridge, rolling thunder across the valley. Wind swept through the courtyard, bending the trees and scattering petals. Yet the warrior's blade flowed on, silent and unshaken. He met the chaos not with resistance, but with rhythm. Modern psychology would call this dynamic stillness a state where presence remains stable despite external turbulence. The samurai called it zanshin, remaining mind, the presence that lingers even after the action ends. When the final strike came, it was not a strike at all. The blade stopped mid-motion, hovering in air like a thought unfinished. The warrior exhaled slowly and lowered his weapon. The sound of rain began to fall, soft, cleansing, eternal. The master stepped forward. "What do you hear?" The student smiled faintly. "Everything," he said. "And nothing." The master nodded. "Then your training is complete. You have not conquered the sword, you have vanished within it." They stood together beneath the falling rain. No words, no bow, no ritual. Only the quiet understanding shared between two souls who had walked the same invisible road, the path that begins with struggle and ends with stillness. That night, as the fire burned low, the warrior sat alone in the dojo. The air smelled of cedar and smoke. He thought of the first day he had arrived, angry, restless, chasing power. He thought of fear, of failure, of pain. All of it now felt distant, like ripples on water that had long returned to calm. He picked up the same broom he had once despised and swept the floor in silence, not out of duty, but gratitude. The circle was complete. Before extinguishing the final candle, he wrote his last line on the wall, the only lesson worth remembering. The path to strength was never about becoming more, but about becoming less. The flame flickered, then went out. Outside, the mountain wind carried his breath into the night. There was no sound, no struggle, no self, only presence. The path to unstoppable strength is not found in the battle outside, but in the quiet war within. When the ego fades, when fear bows, when discipline burns away all that is false, what remains is not the warrior you hope to become, but the truth you already were. And that truth, like the silent blade, does not cut, it reveals.